Okay, so for those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Tyler Moore. I'm a biology professor at Bellevue University, so right here in your community. If you ever have any biology questions or thoughts, or just kind of want to stop by and talk science, we're always around. So today I want to really talk about how the plant communities within our communities are enriching our human communities. So how are these little habitat areas that we're designing around the city contributing to value for humans? And let me know if you can't hear me, or if things aren't sharing properly, and I'll see if I can get things fixed. I think should be looking good so far. So first off, what do ecosystems do for us? What these little habitats really are ecosystems. And we tend to think of these things as ecosystem services. This is the benefit that these little habitats, these little ecosystems can provide for humans. One of the things that these little habitats can do is provide provisioning services. So this is how we get raw materials, so like lumber and food and medicine and water. Nature does this for us, so we don't live outside of nature. If we're going to get lumber or food or medicine, all of the things, the physical materials that we need for survival and living quality lives come from this entity of nature. We have regulating services, the things that all kind of make Earth hospitable for humans. So storing carbon is really important right now, purifying air and water, reducing flood. So all of this is just making Earth a stable place for humans to live. But I don't really want to talk about either of those things today. I want to talk about something that I think is very immediately beneficial and very easily relatable to us humans, and that's the cultural services. And what this is really the cultural benefit that these ecosystems can provide to us in terms of education, how these little communities of plants can teach us about the world and about nature, and how they can provide a spiritual impact for people and just make the world a more beautiful place. So what really makes a more culturally rewarding ecosystem? So this can come in multiple ways. This can be an ecosystem that's more beautiful. This could be plants that hold a particularly important spiritual value to particular groups of people. I think indigenous people have a very tight relationship with many of our native plants. Some of them have been used for cultural ceremonies or medicines or food. This is an important cultural benefit of an ecosystem. One thing that I want to talk about today is how a culturally rewarding ecosystem is one where the more you look, the more you see. The closer you look at every little thing, the more interesting little things that you find. Why is that culturally rewarding? Because it makes the world more interesting. So this is an example of a photo on campus. This is our hillside that we designed to be a little habitat on campus. And I want to contrast it to this, which is actually, this is a Google Earth, Google Maps image from my neighborhood. And this is a walk that I often take. We take our dogs on a walk around the neighborhood, and this is what we see. Now, where is there a possibility to experience anything new on this walk? We see homogeneous lawns in every direction. There are trees, but basically that it's a lot of the same 2 or 3 species of tree planted over and over again. And so if we're really trying to create an ecosystem where we can get this cultural benefit, where every time we pass through an area, there's a new experience to be had, there's a new creature to be seen. If we go through an area with that, this is not it. No offense to my wonderful neighbors who do such a good job at keeping their grass so green. And so these ecosystems really start with the plants. And I'm going to just give a really brief basic biology lesson for why it all starts with the plants. We've got carbon dioxide floating around in the air. It comes out every time animals breathe. It comes out every time something burns. Every time there's that chemical reaction we call combustion, that is putting out carbon dioxide. And so it's floating around in the air. And lucky for us, plants are able to use the power from the sun and take that carbon dioxide and build it into a slightly bigger molecule that is glucose. And they use that glucose to form all of the structures. So they use that as an energy source. They can use it to form stems and leaves of plants and flower petals, and they can build it into more complex carbon molecules and to make bark and roots. And all of this comes from using the energy from the sun to take that carbon dioxide out of the air. Well, of course, the problem here is animals can't do this. We've got all of these little caterpillars here. They can't photosynthesize, which is that process I just described, using the energy from the sun to take carbon dioxide out. But what they can do is they can eat things that did photosynthesize. Humans are the same thing. We can't photosynthesize, but we can eat things that did. And also, you could maybe think of adding a bee into this example. They also can't photosynthesize, but they can eat some of these byproducts from plants that are generated as another compound as a result of that photosynthesis process. Nectar, pollen, and they can use that pollen to feed their young to grow up more offspring. Now, many of these caterpillars are actually feeding on small subsets of plants. They've, over the courses of many thousands, maybe even millions of years of evolution, we get the specialization of a lot of these caterpillars, and really bees as well, on feeding on particular plants. They get really good at it and they overcome some of the plant's defenses, and they're sitting in this wonderful balance. Here's just a few examples of some caterpillars that would be feeding on plants in this picture. So we have a Kentucky coffee tree over here, a legume tree, and one of the things that would eat the leaves of this is the honey locust moth. This is the caterpillar, and then up here is the moth. A bunch of caterpillars eat echinacea and plants in the Asteraceae family. Here are a couple examples of the checker spot on the left and the wavy line emerald moth on the right. All of the grasses that are kind of weaving in amongst these flowers are a host plant for skipper caterpillars, and those skipper caterpillars will metamorphose into these skipper butterflies. And on this hill in particular, based on the data sets generated by Doug Tallamy's group, we've calculated that we can get 187 unique caterpillar species supported by the plants on this hill. There's quite a bit of overlap in species of caterpillar that will eat different plants, but this hill alone could theoretically support 187 unique species. So how can we design these plant communities in order to support the most species of little critters that we could observe to make the world that we live in more interesting and culturally rewarding? Well, I think this is a really quick, easy example from a book that I really enjoy called Planting in a Post-Wild World, Rayner and West. And what they like to do is really kind of have this as a 3-layered design to create not a garden, so to speak, but a plant community. So you start with a ground layer, which is, occupying all of the space in between plants. This could be a grass, or it could be a sedge or something like that. And then you go up a layer to plants that would pop up with the seasons. So like little clusters of things that kind of flower within seasons. And then a structural layer, well, maybe it's something that's very, dynamic and stands taller than the rest. It could be a tree. In this case, this is like Joe Pye weed, which, towards the end of the season where it's very tall and robust. And so in this, you are occupying all of the plant niches that are there. So there's really not as much room for weeds, and you have a lot of plant diversity there to support a lot of interesting little creatures. This is a photo I took the other day just to kind of illustrate the value of this. These are both little snapshots from on campus. On the left is our, quote unquote, formal garden, where we have sparse plants with a lot of mulch in between. And on the right, we have our hillside. So it has been mowed, and we just have some plants that are just now kind of popping up. But on the left, you can see all these dandelions that are popping up through the mulch as the mulch is degrading. And so what you really have to do, if you want this mulch to be a continuous weed barrier to these sparse plants, is you have to continually apply mulch. But in contrast, these plants continue to grow thicker and continue to become a more robust weed barrier. And not only are they blocking out a lot of these weeds from coming in, but they're also functioning in the habitat as well. So they're a plant that can be eaten by something. They're a plant that can provide habitat for one of these little interesting creatures that makes our communities more interesting. So Benjamin Vogt was the one that we kind of worked with to kind of help design this space into a community garden perspective. His website's monarchguard.com, which I think he has a lot of good information on there if you want to check that out. There's just a little bit of a dissection of this space in particular on Bellevue campus, just because I happen to have photos of this one, and we've been around since the construction of it, so I know a little bit more of what it's composed of. So we kind of have these structural layers. We've a couple trees. This bur oak was obviously around before we planted this. This is an older bur oak that I was glad we kept. There's a new Kentucky coffee tree, and then over kind of out of frame here, we also have a Princeton elm, which is an American elm cultivar that's resistant to Dutch elm disease. Kind of we have this matrix layer that was that underlying ground cover. And this came from Bouteloua curtipendula, which is side oats grama, which was from seed, as well as Carex vulpinoidea. This is fox sedge from plugs, and then some little blue stem from plugs and some purple lovegrass from plugs. And these were planted in drifts in kind of an organized way. That are a little bit obscured right now, I'll admit, because we have so many annuals that are blooming. These photos are from last year. And we have so many annuals because this space is designed to be a plant community which is undergoing natural succession. So these plant communities are not static entities like some of these formal gardens you may have grown up with. In fact, they're meant to be dynamic and shifting over time. And you as the gardener, or as the habitat manager, so to speak, of your little space, you can manipulate how that dynamic occurs in order for this habitat to serve your interest the best as possible. So in our area, what naturally happens after a disturbance is we first colonize the area with some of these early successional plants. This is like Rudbeckia, Coreopsis. And then as the site stabilizes as a prairie, we get more dominance of long-lived but slow to develop flowers. Like here, you can see this purple flower is Baptisia. And then grasses become more dominant that take a little bit more time to get established, but they can usually dominate out over a lot of the forbs. And then even longer, we might move into maybe a shrubby area with some smattering of oaks. And really, depending on how close we are to the river, in terms of habitat, this might turn into a full forest without any disturbance if we just let things go. And just to show on this site here in particular, we're mostly looking at early successional species still. This is really just a couple years after the site was put in. And so we see these pink flowers here. This is Echinacea pallida, which can sometimes bloom the first year from seed. These were put in from plugs. So this is a couple years old. Rudbeckia hirta, which is often a biennial, so it can come up and then kind of bloom the second year, sometimes even the first year, and it often will die after that. Or if not, it won't live much longer. Coreopsis tinctoria, which is this kind of flower over in the corner, is an annual, so it will bloom and then go to seed, but they don't really stick around very long in most habitats. And so over time, we're going to expect this to transition into some of those more long-lived perennial species and become more dominant. And we are going to actively control this succession of this site to prevent it from going to forest. In fact, we're going to prevent it from going into a shrub layer, and we're going to try to prevent it from going into completely grasses, because we want to maintain the diversity of flowers, because we want to have that culturally rewarding habitat with all of these little creatures in it. Not to mention the other ecosystem services, which we haven't really talked about today, which isn't the focus of today. This is a fairly big space. It's probably a bigger space than you typically would have in your backyards or your apartment porch. I just want to point out that any size plant community can improve our human community. These are a couple examples from Blazing Star Gardens. This is a garden design firm out of Minnesota. And I just think they have a really good illustration of how these designs can work. And I think they show a cool example that are kind of inspiring. This is just a typical median. And then we've got a little kind of a parking lot space that you might otherwise see as a big chunk of mulch with maybe a few bushes in there, or maybe a tree, a single tree, and then surrounded by nothing but mulch, maybe lawn. But this is showing an alternative here, right? Well, this is a more interesting walk, an opportunity to see more interesting things. And all of these collectively, as they're increasing around our city, are just making our city a better place, a more enjoyable place to live. And we can have these native plants that are supporting insects, and they're supporting this diversity of life, and they're making our city a more interesting place without them being kind of this wild design. So you can also use these plants in a more formal design, and they still have a lot of the benefits of supporting this biodiversity because of the fact that they co-evolved with these insects and other creatures that use them. So this is a couple photos. The one on the right is from Planting in a Post-Wild World as well. So you can see on the left, we have a kind of a clean row of sedges here that are kind of forming this border. This is that grass-like thing. Behind that, we've got Asclepias tuberosa, and we've got some other milkweeds, and I think there's even like a tall silphium here back here. And even with that, this looks pretty formal. And you can see this is in a really classically designed neighborhood. The neighbor over here has a very classic landscaping, and this blends in pretty well with the neighborhood, despite using all native plants that are going to be highly beneficial to species that have specialized for it. So there was a question that the formal design is more maintenance, right? And so I would say, yeah, so if you have this formal area that you kind of have on the left, where mulch is your main weed deterrent in there, there probably are going to get weeds coming up in there, and if you're not every year putting more mulch on. You can do this in a way, I think that, so what you see here, like in these designs, eventually these sedges are meant to spread everywhere in between all of these forbs, so these little grass-like patches here. And so what happens over time is, as by the time the mulch degrades, the goal is to have grasses or sedges everywhere where the mulch was. So what you have is kind of flowers in a sea of grasses or mulches. So I think there's a thing you can balance in there, right? But even this, this is a pretty thick planting on the left. There's not a ton of opportunity for weeds to come in there, even though this underlying layer is open. Most of the other plants are kind of shading it out. So I think you do get a decent weed barrier there. The one on the left, I think, is an interesting example. So this is taking just a boxwood, and you can trim it into this very formal shape. And then because of that very rigid formal design, you can inside have a little bit more unorganized look because it has that very clean border. So inside of this, you can have maybe, this is patches of asters and rudbeckia, and it might be Monarda bradburyana. But anyways, that you don't need as much organization inside of there because you've got that frame. And you could do that frame with a hardscaping. You could do that frame with shrubs like this that are more formal looking shrubs. And I think the point here is that if you give these hard edges, you might get something that looks more formal if you have a neighborhood or an area that really demands formality. And that if it's going to be a formal native garden or turf, you're better off with a formal native garden. So I would lean towards that. And I'm always hoping to show people these examples so they see that they're not, we don't have to have something that looks like this, which may not be for everyone's front yard, for example, but it can work pretty well on a college campus. I think there's gradients of what these designs can look like. One thing I always like to point out to people is where to get some native plants. They're not often available at big box nurseries. So the plants that you might be most familiar with, if you're a gardener that goes to Home Depot or to Lowe's, they're probably 90% not native plants. And in fact, many of them might even be invasive plants that are ecologically detrimental. These are a couple of my favorite native nurseries and such, because so every plant that they carry is native. The vast majority, the seeds actually come from Nebraska. And so if you order a plant from one of these nurseries, for one, you know that it's not invasive. And two, it's going to be native to our state, and so it's going to be highly beneficial. So then all you really have to do is pick something out that you like, just like the way you would do if you go to Home Depot to pick out a plant or something like that. You just pick out something that you like the color of, you like the shape of, you like the structure of, and it's going to be ecologically valuable. And these are grown without pesticides, and they're really grown in a very ecologically friendly way, grown locally. And they're benefiting our community economically as well as ecologically. And a question that I often get is, this is nice, this is great, but what about these massive wildlife refuges and national parks? So this is an example from, this is Pawnee National Grasslands, where we went camping last summer, where you have these massive uninterrupted grasslands. And why would we even care about all of these little pockets of habitat in our cities? We should be preserving these huge grasslands. Well, of course, we definitely need these. There are some species that will only live on these massive grasslands. This is a an upland sandpiper. It's actually, this photo is from the Nebraska Sandhills, where we have these huge expanses of grassland. And upland sandpipers will not come to your backyard and nest. They really need a very large grassland. So we do need these large, massive wildlife refuges and national parks. But the issue is they can't be really performing that much of a cultural, ecological, environmental service, because in order to do that, they have to be close to people. People have to be able to interact with them. And that's why we also need this, because we can only get the cultural benefit from habitats if we experience them. So if the only habitat that exists is hundreds or thousands of miles from where humans are, it's providing other benefits. It's providing biodiversity, it's sequestering carbon, but it's not really providing a day-to-day cultural benefit. So these plants that are providing all of these little interesting creatures for us to experience on a daily basis are what's really providing the strongest cultural benefit. And the further those habitats get from where people live, the less connected they are to the people. So I want to go through just a few things that we've seen just kind of in our yard alone to hopefully get you inspired for some of the little creatures that you could see around your property, in your neighborhood parks, and things that you're going to see more frequently the more habitat we create in Bellevue and the surrounding area and other areas where people live, and give more people, even those who live in cities and even in densely populated areas, the opportunity to grow up and live with these areas with diverse habitats, with opportunities to see diverse creatures. This is a Lasioglossum species bee. These are very little tiny bees, about the size of a grain of rice. This one is eating from Heuchera, coral bells. There's some native species of coral bells, and we have these around our properties. Heuchera richardsonii. In order to find these and experience these, you'll need open soil, because these are ground nesters. So they form a little tunnel and they will lay their eggs in there and raise their young by bringing pollen back to these nests. And because these are generalists that have a long life cycle, a long period where they're alive, you really need flowers to be blooming continuously throughout the season in order to keep these funny little critters alive. And even though they're small, these can be really important pollinators of wildflowers and vegetables because of the fact that they can be in really large numbers. So even though they may not have the pollen per bee of like a bumblebee, the numbers of Lasioglossum can really make them important pollinators. This is a Hylaeus bee. Sometimes they're called masked bees because they have this little yellow mask on their face. They usually nest in dead plant stems. So this is one of the reasons to leave your stems up at least, maybe a foot or two from the previous year. And then those previous year's plant stems can serve as nesting habitat for these little tiny bees. If you know this flower, this is Eryngium yuccifolium, which is rattlesnake master. Just to show you how small this bee is. It's just sitting amongst the anthers of rattlesnake master. So yes, these are very tiny things, but these are tiny things that make our day-to-day life a little bit more interesting. We don't know very much about the pollen needs of many of the species in Hylaeus, but there is a decent indication that they might need specific native flowers to gather pollen. One of my favorite bees is the bees that are in the Megachile genus, and these are the leafcutter bees. And I always like them because they stick their abdomen up in the air like this, and they have this really iconic posture. This one is getting nectar from Asclepias tuberosa, which is butterfly milkweed, which is the only plant that monarch caterpillars can eat, but it's also a really beneficial flower for native bees as well. Now, another thing I like about these is they cut out these little notches from the leaves of plants, and they kind of roll those up into a little sleeping bag, and that's where they lay their eggs. And I will say they tend to be generalists, but I often see leafcutter bees on our milkweed. I know not everyone likes spiders, but how can you not like a jumping spider? They just have these big eyes coming out in the front of you. And if a spider can be cute, jumping spiders certainly are. We don't know very much about a lot of these spiders. I saw one paper that categorized this particular species, and they found that they were more common in the tree canopy compared to the understory, which was opposite of most of the other jumping spiders. This one I observed in a chokeberry bush at our house. So I guess you could call that the understory. So we really don't know very much about these. You could be the ones responsible for learning about them. This is the goldenrod soldier beetle. They are an important predator of pest insects. They usually can be seen on goldenrod in the fall. They overwinter in the leaf litter, so it's important to leave that leaf litter around so they can do that overwintering. This is the margin calligrapher. This is a syrphid fly or a flower fly. The larvae eat aphids, but the adults eat pollen and nectar. And so these are considered a beneficial insect because they reduce pests. This is a moth caterpillar, and moths sometimes get a bad reputation because they eat our vegetable crops and stuff like that. But moths are important food for a lot of organisms, especially at this caterpillar state. Moths are way more numerous in species than butterflies, and so there's a lot more moth caterpillars around. And I just think these little, this is on Agasaki. This is little tiny green inchworm that I got to watch kind of inch out to the edge of this flower. And when you're talking about culturally rewarding experiences, just sitting and watching a little inchworm caterpillar is as rewarding as you can get. We have Melisodes bees. So this is, these are longhorn bees. They nest in the ground, they're solitary, and these are really important for pollination of a lot of crops. If you think of like squash and pumpkin, these can be really good pollinators. Some of these are specialists on some of those native vegetables like squash and pumpkin, which are native to North America. There are native bee species that are the primary pollinator of those. This is Halictus ligatus, which is it's a little sweat bee. They nest in wood or in the ground. And I think one really neat thing about this species is they are of Asian origin, and they only came to North America about 10,000-ish years ago, and they probably came across with humans. So this is a bee that has been providing culturally rewarding experiences for humans for thousands of years. And in fact, the earliest humans in North America came with this little bee. I know not everyone's a big fan of spiders, but look how interesting this thing was. So when I saw this in our yard, I had never seen one before. This is Macranthina, and they have these strange little spikes on their abdomen, and no one really knows what they're for. It's possible that they prevent parasitoid wasps from coming and landing and stinging. They don't seem like they would be threatening enough to deter a bird, but they must have some purpose, otherwise they wouldn't have evolved. This is a lovely little leafhopper. We know almost nothing about it, but I had a lovely cultural experience getting to watch it until, as I got my camera up close to it, it jumped about 40 feet away. Amazing little jumping things. This is a nomada species. These are cuckoo bees, and so they lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. And a lot of these are specialists, and they will lay their eggs in only the nests of species where they have co-evolved. So a lot of times these nomada are specialized for Andrena bees. And so if that's the case, seeing these nomada bees around which kind of look like wasps because they don't have a lot of fur, because they don't need to carry pollen because their host carries all the pollen for them. If you see these bees around, it means that you have a nice, healthy ecosystem because you have enough of their host species around for them to live. This is one from this spring. It's a comma butterfly. The caterpillars eat elm tree leaves, but also nettles. So these nettles that you might not like because they sting, because we have stinging nettles, and there's also some non-stinging nettles. They're an important host plant for actually numerous species of wonderful butterfly. And the adults overwinter under leaves. So if you take all of the leaves from the trees off of your property every year, then you're taking away all of these butterflies that you could be having. So if you leave those leaves somewhere on your property, even if you just kind of move them to somewhere that you would prefer, using them as mulch maybe, you are creating more habitat for these interesting creatures to experience. You may not have seen these before. This is a long-legged fly. They like areas around water. They like moist soil. And they are interesting predators. So you can see here, this one has its prey in its mouth. Its jaw is extended. It's been eating this. And these are very tiny little flies. You may not notice unless you're really looking for them. They have these beautiful green eyes. And they're predators of a lot of important pest species like thrips and aphids and mites. And many, 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 many more. So this is just a photo of what our backyard looks like, just kind of the combination of plants from one of the angles. And then here's, a bunch more of the little things that we could see on our little journeys through our cities, through our suburbs, through our yards, as long as we provide space for them. And they're here and able to make our lives more interesting. So if you want to learn anything more, you can go to natureamongus.com, which it's got a lot more of my photos and stuff, and I've been putting up articles and stuff, things to read. Benjamin Vogt's website, monarchguard.com. He's been putting articles up for a long time. He's got photos up and a lot of information and about individual plants. Again, I think Planting in a Post-Wild World is really my favorite book for thinking about designing these habitat spaces in our cities. There are a few others, but this is the one I think if you were to get one book, I think it's an easy one to recommend. And, if you want to really learn more, come study biology with us. So you can go to sciencecenter.bellevue.edu, kind of learn about our biology program. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. Okay, so a couple of questions here, and then if anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. One is what to tell people who are afraid of bees or insects in general. And I will say, just not to go on too long, but I never was a huge fan of insects or spiders and things growing up. I always liked photography. And then once I had kids, I wanted to spend more time at home with my kids instead of, going out to spots to take photos. And so I started looking into how could I create more photo opportunities around my house. And the thing that seemed the most interesting to photograph around our house would be little insects and bugs. And even though I wasn't immediately fond of them, I thought of them as an interesting photo subject. And so I started looking into how could I create habitat around our house so I could just go out for 20 minutes and enjoy taking photos and then come back in, and I'm not spending a lot of time away from my family. And as I was spending more time with these things, I really started to fall in love with them. And I think it's just like anything, right? So prejudices come from ignorance. So when we have a prejudice against something, it's almost always because we haven't spent enough time with it and we haven't really given our chance to get to know it. So I think when we really spend some time getting to learn these things, you can't help but fall in love with how interesting they are. If you're afraid of bees or wasps in particular, I'll tell you that you see these photos. I spend a lot of my summers with a camera about 1.5 inches away from bees and wasps. and I have not been stung at all. My only time that I was stung was last year when I tried to dig out a yellow jacket nest from our hillside on campus, and I will not try to do that again. Long story short. Dawn asks if there was any watering other than rain on the hillside, and no, we didn't water it at all. So, I mean, it's the trick, right? That if you're planting plugs, the first week or two after you plant them, it's good to get some water. So if you can plant before a rain, then you might not need to water at all. After a couple weeks, once those roots really start moving into the actual soil, they should be fine. And so we haven't watered at all. It's done quite well. And in fact, some of the areas on the lower far side, which get a little bit of the irrigation from the lawn, those have more weeds. So I would say overwatering seems to be a good way to get weeds in, because a lot of the lawn weeds that we have are well adapted to very highly irrigated lawns, whereas a lot of the prairie plants are adapted to our current level of rain. So they can compete pretty well if the water's limited, in my experience. And then there's another question on campus. The vast majority was plugs. The only thing that was seed was some annuals and the side oats. So the goal with the plugs is to give it a little bit more of an organized look. And honestly, it doesn't really look super organized now. And that's probably, I know it's the result of the major blooming flowers in the first, year or so, where we have these photos are annuals. So we have these huge masses of annual blooming flowers. This year and the next year, I think we're going to see more of the structural drifts in the designs. If you do straight seed, it's going to be pretty messy. So it's like what we have with, you're going to get big clusters of flowers. When those flowers are not blooming, it's just a big cluster of different types of foliage that can look messy to the, casual observer. Any other questions? Yeah, we'll make the recording available, and feel free to share it around if you have people who maybe are on the fence about creating habitat in our communities, and you think this might convince them at all, then yeah, feel free to share.